Dear Father Simon and the ever-merciful collective, says Brastoff, I wish to seek forgiveness for a deed perpetrated some 40 years ago, which took place on a North Gwent orchestra course held in a local comprehensive school. As we all know, an orchestra is divided into several sections, and I was a member of the brass section. I should point out for the uninitiated that the brass band environment is very competitive, and it's not a genre open to any other of the orchestra sections apart from percussion. Therefore, we considered ourselves a little bit above the penny whistlers, the woodwind, and certainly above the bow scrapers, strings. Who needs them? They, on the other hand, considered the rather loutish brass section as nothing other than a bunch of knuckle draggers. How very dare they? The conductor of the orchestra, Mr. Jones we should call him, was on the side of the enemy, as he was that most abhorrent of things, a woodwind teacher. Who knew?
This is great. I love this.
So much tribalism in this particular story. It's amazing an orchestra can hang together at all, isn't it, really, when they all hate each other so much. One Saturday at the end of the autumn term, we all broke for lunch as usual, and we knuckle draggers had decided that we would head to the high street, as we usually did. During our wanderings, we passed a fishmonger's, and with no particular plan in mind, we cobbled together some money. We bought 2 rather large trout. Then, on our way back to the school, we hatched a plan. We would split into 2 divisions, the trumpets and the trombones, each with its own mission, and each with its own fish. As we entered the school, most people were heading back to the main hall to recommence the rehearsal. With no one around us trumpet players, armed with Trout number 1, we headed to the girls' toilets, a place of great mystery to a bunch of teenage boys. We entered, and I placed the fish carefully into cubicle number 1's toilet bowl, head facing up, as if it had just swum up the toilet. Its eyes stared wildly at the ceiling, and its mouth was wide open. We giggled like a bunch of 8-year-olds and scarpered, ensuring no one saw us. We then headed to join the others in the hall. Afternoon break arrived, and we quickly gathered in the corridor where both sets of toilets were located. We hung around the boys' side and waited to see what would happen. Before long, the youngest member of the orchestra, who happened to be an oboe player, entered the girls' toilets. We held our breath, but we didn't have to hold it for long. There was an almighty scream, and this girl ran out of the toilet wailing, "There's a fish! There's a fish in the toilet!" Her fellow woodwinders all gathered round. She sobbed slightly, and a female tutor was hurriedly fetched. At that point, we thought we'd better make ourselves scarce, and so we cleared off. When the orchestra had gathered and seated, none of the tutors could at first be seen. Then the middle door opened, and they all entered, trailing in one behind the other. Last one in, Mr. Jones. However, he was not alone. He was accompanied by Trout number 1, which he had skewered with his baton and was carrying it upright into the hall. We in the brass section had never come closer to wetting ourselves than this moment. It was agonizing. Mr. Jones spoke briefly, and though it was some time ago, I can remember the short speech delivered whilst he stared fixedly at the brass section. "We have found a fish."
Really?
As they speak like this in North Gwent. Okay?
Yes.
"We have found a fish in the girls' toilets. Just because it was in the girls' toilets, none of us are fooled that it was actually put there by a girl." He then flung Trout number 1 in the general area of the brass section. Wasn't a bad shot, just flying over the head of the first trombone player and landing with a squelch. Most people laughed, with the exception of some of the woodwind, and in particular the oboe player. Wiping the baton down, Mr. Jones calmly uttered the immortal words, "From the Allegro, please." Now, as mentioned earlier, there were actually 2 fish. What Mr. Jones didn't know was that Trout number 1 was a mere diversionary tactic. During the afternoon break, the trombonists had been busy. With, I suspect, the help of a coarse tutor, who to this day has remained nameless, they had managed to appropriate Mr. Jones's car keys from the staff room. Popping the bonnet, they had expertly wedged Trout number 2 between the car frame and the radiator, then quickly closed the bonnet and replaced the keys. Now, Mr. Jones often gave some of his woodwind pupils a lift home, so our thoughts were that on a cold evening they would all be treated to a fishy-smelling homeward journey. This part of the prank, however, didn't go to plan. Unbeknownst to us, Mr. Jones went straight home that night with no extra passengers, and as he didn't have to travel that far, there was no chance for Trout number 2 to do its work. What happened next was actually relayed to us by our own brass tutor, suspect number one in the tutor-assistant scandal, I might say. It transpires that Trout number 2 had an unpredicted, rather cold overnight stop in Mr. Jones's car. However, the following morning, Mr. Jones was scheduled to take his mother-in-law to church.
Of course.
Which wasn't just down the road,
No,
but indeed some miles away.
Yeah.
Long enough, as it happened, for Trout number 2 to fulfil its potential. So if you can picture the scene, on a cold December Sunday morning, heater on full, Mr. Jones, wife and mother-in-law in tow, headed off. All the while, Trout number 2 was nicely frying on the radiator. Apparently after 4 miles, the smell had become unbearable, with smoke billowing from the bonnet. Mr. Jones got out of the car, opened the bonnet, only to find Trout number 2 partly fried and partly frozen, lying across his radiator. His wife and mother-in-law had exited the car by then also. They never made it to church, but turned around and headed home, with windows wide open, freezing as they went. All their clothes eventually had to be binned, as apparently nothing could get rid of the wretched fish smell. So anyway, Father Simon, I seek forgiveness not from the oboe player who was so shaken up by the unexpected appearance of a fish in the toilet bowl. She was young, she had years to get over it. And she played an oboe. Not from Mr. Jones, who perpetuated the continued development of woodwind players for years to come, but from his wife and mother-in-law, who were unintended victims of Trout number 2, who ended up smelling of fish and never made it to church. Brassed off. So many undercurrents of rivalry and hatred, all in one orchestra. North Gwent is clearly a hotbed for this kind of thing. What do you say, Sister Bobby?
Well, it's tricky because there were some innocent victims, right? Mrs. Jones and mother-in-law. They didn't really deserve to be stunk out quite like that, did they? But it wasn't your intention. You had other intentions which should have worked. I don't think actually this is too malicious. I think it actually is great fun. I wouldn't have done this, but I would have laughed at this. So I think actually in this time I will generally forgive you, except for a terrible waste of fish. But you are forgiven. Great story.
Okay, all right. Brother Matthew.
What I love about this story is that listening to this at home, there will be members of orchestras going, yeah, typical oboist.
Woodwind teachers,
do
don't you
get
hate
over
them?
it. Come on. Brass band, what do you expect? Brass.
Classic knuckle draggers.
Trombone, come on. So I love that. And also, you know, it was the 70s, different times, everyone. So getting fish and putting them on radiators, pretty common practice there. Unintended consequences, I would say. That's what this is all about. They didn't know he was going to be taking his mother-in-law to church the next day and he wouldn't be using the car in between times. So, you know, them's the breaks. So I am definitely going to forgive.
You made my wife smell of fish, and I'm not putting up with that.